Chapter 2. A Knocking Sound. A day of walking in the woods was now becoming a night of it. It might have been easy for a man or woman in good shape to make a trek going the long way to the village, but for a girl of merely 9, it was nigh impossible. The sun had now set, and although in the summer it was still cold in the countryside of Bran, if it had been winter the girl might have frozen completely to death. As it was, even though she was simply in her nightgown, she had a fighting chance. However, her stamina was wavering, as she had been walking for many, many hours at this point, and even the slightest of breezes in the dark chilled her to her bones. There was no denying the girl was lost. She had never gone to town without either of her parents before, but she feared returning home. Home in silence, where there was once voices and laughter. An understanding woman with a loving but haunted man. The girl didn't know what her father had been seeing or hearing in the night, but when she finally saw them for herself, they were not only in the woods as he said, they were in her home. It was her fault. She left the front door open. Her mother had told her again and again never to leave the front door open. She should have closed it, but she ran out in a hurry, and now she had let the monsters in. Her mother must have believed her father all along, and just pretended she didn't to keep the girls from being afraid. At least she had that comfort now, but that was all she had. The only bit of solace in the infinite dark, as she wandered through unfamiliar woods, where bear and mountain lion wander, though those creatures were now far down her list of things to fear. What if they had followed her? What if the monsters could see her now, in the dark, crying and alone? She gripped her nightie tight and sat down in the grass. The wind blew above, and the trees creaked and rocked back and forth. An owl called, and another owl somewhere far away answered. The girl shut her eyes tight and continued to cry. Then she heard it. It was loud immediately, with brief pauses in between, but she knew the sound well from when her father spoke of it, though this was her first time actually hearing it. It echoed through the woods, interrupting the imposing silence of a smothering nature. A knocking sound, loud and repetitive. There were at least 8 knocks, hard and purposeful. There was no sound in nature to match it. A rest followed. The girl held her breath and opened her eyes. She scanned around but could see almost nothing. Again she heard the creaking of the trees, but she supposed the knocking had frightened the owls away, as she did not hear them again. Suddenly, the knocking returned. At least 10 this time, in slow succession as before. Were they getting closer? No, at least, she didn't think so. But she did not plan to stay long to find out. She gathered her strength in what remained of her bravery and set off again. She didn't know what direction to go, or even if she had been turned around and going back the same direction she came. All she knew was that it was away from the knocking sound. Her mind swirled in the blackness. The imagination of the child began to create shapes in the dark, shapes that had made her face fall to numbness if she thought about them too long. Faces formed where there hadn't been faces before. Bodies and long, outstretched arms materialized from pale light and shadow. Was it the shadow creatures? The ones who looked like wolves and men? Were they upon her as she feared they would eventually be? Were they so intent on finishing the job they had started? It was all too much. Her legs gave way, not from exhaustion, but from trembling. Her fear was unmatched at any other point in her life, and she collapsed again, crying hysterically. She was deathly afraid of the dark, even more so now than ever before. But she was all out of grown-ups to run to. All out of those who could take care of her. They were all gone. Taken by the dark. How many owls might have watched the girl as she lay on the ground in the dry grass and pine needles? How many coyotes might have wandered by, wondering if this could be potential prey. The girl did not know how long she lay there before things started to strangely become more clear in front of her. She wiped her eyes where she lay to clear the tears and muck from her swollen eyelids so she could make sure her imagination wasn't toying with her. Yes, she could see certain details now. The darkness was becoming less engulfing, less overpowering. She could see the detail now of the bark on the tree in front of her. She could almost count the blades of grass at its base. She was starting to see, but why? She sat up and noticed that the dark became devouring again on the tree she was examining. It was her shadow. She was casting a shadow in the pitch-black night, but it wasn't pitch black anymore. There was a faint light, and it was coming from behind her, growing brighter by the minute. She turned to see a lamp of some sort afar off yet, but it was coming her direction. She must have been on the correct route, because as it got closer, she could see that it was the small headlamp of some kind of vehicle. As the vehicle drew nearer, she stood and stared at it. She didn't wave her arms or do anything to draw its attention. She had been raised well not to speak to strangers. The rumbling of the motor was heard now, and it grew louder with each passing foot, but the vehicle did begin to slow as it approached the young girl. She held up her hand to block her eyes from the blinding light. She saw the vehicle come to a stop just a few feet away from her with a small squeaking sound, and now she could see that it was a small four-wheeler, but the driver looked much too big to be riding on it. Indeed, the whole ATV sprung slightly upward as the driver dismounted, and she could hear the springs underneath squeal with relief. The tires were caked with mud and gravel, and the back of the vehicle had bundles of ropes, along with a bucket that looked as if there was a tool of some kind sticking out of it. The driver took a few steps and stood between the headlight of the four-wheeler and the little girl, looking down at her. He was bigger than anyone else she had ever seen, and she supposed, even, that he might have been a giant, like in her Bible picture book. He wore a long coat with fur along the top and a raccoon skin cap on his head. She supposed that he might have been a lumberjack, which would have explained the noises she heard, that being an axe striking a tree. But oddly, she saw no axe on the vehicle, nor on his person, and the man didn't have a beard. All lumberjacks had beards, she thought. But this man was clean-shaven as far as she could tell. Very big, though, built like she imagined a lumberjack to have been built. The stranger looked down on her, expressionless at first. Then his face grew into a grin beneath his lazy-looking eyes. When he spoke, his voice was deep, much deeper than her father's. She had never heard such a voice before. Riding on the back of the four-wheeler, she could not reach around his giant waist. Instead, she gripped the back of his trench coat hard enough to make her fingertips hurt. What might have been another day and a half of walking for the 9-year-old wound up being a couple-hour ride to town that night, thanks to her path crossing with this strange man. She would be taken in by the shopkeeper in town, an older woman who would listen well to her tale and teach her things, many unusual things to explain much of what had happened to her, and who was to thank for her still drawing breath after such an ordeal. The shopkeeper brought old knowledge to her, knowledge of her ancestors that forged the first living in that near Arctic country where brave men did not used to venture. For the time being, the night was over, it seemed, but in 7 years' time, the sun would set on Bran again, and the old ways of knowledge still circulating, thanks to the adopted shopkeeper's daughter and some respected elders in the town, would come back to offer sanctuary in a very uncertain time.